But this is Child Abuse Mandated Reporter Training. My name is Sarah Whitney. I work for the County of San Diego. I work in child welfare in the Indian Specialty Unit, so all of the kiddos I work with are of Native American descent. I've been with the county on and off for 17 years. I also was a caseworker for the Port Gamble S'Klallam tribe up in Washington State for 3 years. I do this training several times a year for various places, various tribes, various communities, just so you know, as a mandated reporter, what's required of you. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Does anybody have any questions just to start off that they want to ask before we get started? If you do, just holler them out, raise your hand, be interactive, try to stay awake. But yeah, if you have questions, stop me, and then we'll go over them. Go ahead. Child Welfare Services, the vision is to have healthy, safe, and a thriving San Diego community or communities. Our mission is to make people's lives safer, healthier, and self-sufficient by delivering essential services in San Diego County. The agency as a whole covers child welfare, child support, cash aid, veteran services. The umbrella is really big, but what we're going to focus on is child welfare. Go ahead. The mandated reporting law says mandated reporters are defined as individuals who, within the scope of their jobs, must by law report any knowledge or reasonable suspicion of child abuse or neglect to a child protective agency. So this isn't saying that you have to know. This isn't saying that you have to have any facts. What this is saying is if you have a reasonable suspicion, if you think that this could indeed be child abuse, you're required to report. If you don't know and you don't have a suspicion, then you're not required to report. Go ahead. So if you do have that suspicion, who do you call? You would call a child protective agency, either Child Welfare Services or police or sheriff's department. What determines that is imminent danger. Right now. If you call us, we're going to get out there. Our response time is anywhere from 2 hours to 10 days. If there's a child at immediate risk, call the police, call 911. Example of that, you have maybe an intoxicated parent comes to pick up a kiddo and is telling you you need to give that kiddo to that parent. That child is at imminent risk if they're going to be getting in a car with an intoxicated parent. If the kiddo is coming to school or to the center and is, I don't know, seems a little hungry, isn't properly clothed, you have some suspicion about something going on in the home, some neglect issues, that would be a call to us. Does that make sense?
The first scenario that you mentioned,
Yes.
If a parent is, or the person coming is intoxicated,
Yes.
and is insisting on the child, what power do we have to say no? Or do we have any power at all to say no to letting that kid go with that parent or that adult?
Right. You're not going to put yourself in physical danger, but I would grab him and say, hey, you know what, I'm going to need you to call tribal police, I'm going to need you to call law enforcement because I'm concerned about the safety of this child right now. But you don't ever want to put yourself in harm's way. You got to do what you can to make sure that that child's safe. So it's really use your best judgment, but get help. Get help from your coworkers. Get help from, maybe another parent's there. Hey, maybe we can just talk about this, or hey, why don't we let them?
Stall until the police show up.
Yeah, I would suggest that. Yes. Any other questions on that?
Do you have a card or something with the numbers?
For the hotline, I don't have cards, but Megan will have the numbers,
Okay,
so I'll make sure that she has them,
okay,
and then she can give them to everybody.
perfect.
Any other questions on that? Go ahead. So when you call the child abuse hotline, it's a call center, and it processes all the referrals for child welfare. So everybody who calls the hotline gets somebody on the phone, and you give them the information that you have. They'll ask some questions to try to evaluate, is this immediate risk? Do they need to call law enforcement? And then they'll also decide what our response time is going to be. Any child under the age of 1 with marks and bruises, we are going out in a 2-hour time frame. Broken bones, immediate risk to those littles, we're going to go out right away. Sometimes if there's maybe a DV incident that occurred, the perpetrator's incarcerated, mom's got a restraining order, that might be a 5 or 10-day response, depending on all of the information. When you're giving information, give as much as you can. If you know the names of siblings, who the parents are, where they live, where the child goes to school, apartment numbers, really, really handy. There's an apartment complex that has 600 units in Escondido. So anytime we see that address with no apartment number, we know it's going to be a long day. So the more information you can give, the better. And sometimes they'll determine whether the referral will be investigated, or sometimes what they do is what's called evaluate out. There's not enough information to meet the code for a protective issue. So although you might have concerns and you called and you reported, we may not go out and investigate because it doesn't rise to the level of an investigation. But you did your due diligence as a mandated reporter and you called, and it'll be documented. So who files the report? Usually it's the first person that makes contact with that child. This is probably a better way to do it. If it's 2 of you, whoever has the most information. Whoever's going to know what the concern is, why it's a concern, if the child gave a disclosure, what the child said, or any extenuating circumstances. We only need 1 report from each agency, but you need to make sure that we get that report. If the 2 of you know about it, and you talk about it, and they say you're going to do it, make sure you do it, and the other person makes sure that that person did do it, because we need to get the report. By law, an employer may not impede or sanction an employee for making a report. Sometimes that's difficult. They know the family. They don't really want you to say anything. But by law, you have to report. We never reveal our reporting party. And making reports can cause trust and relationship issues with clients, and we understand that. However, these kiddos, they need us. They can't speak for themselves. So it's our responsibility as mandated reporters to report if we suspect abuse or neglect. Okay, go ahead. When you're filing a report, call immediately. Everything's fresh in your mind. Or as soon as practically possible. Sometimes it's at the end of the shift. Sometimes it's when you get a break. Don't wait a day or 2 days or 3 days. Call as soon as practically possible. Also, written follow-up is required within 36 hours. You can do it on the website on a suspected child abuse report, the SS8572. It's really easy. You fill it out, you email it, and we get it. Or you can just go on Google and Google that, and we'll find it. Or you can fax it. But just make sure there's written documentation of what you reported within 36 hours. Go ahead. One more. That's what the form is going to look like when you Google it. And if you don't know parts of these, leave it blank. Put in what you do know, because some things you're not going to know. Here's the really important stuff to include. Your name, agency name, and phone number. As a mandated reporter, you need to leave that. If you call not within the scope of your profession, you don't have to leave that. We get a lot of anonymous reports. The problem with those is when we get a report, I'm going to want to call the reporting party and say, hey, do you have further information? Hey, do you have apartment numbers? Hey, does this kid have siblings? Hey, do you have any other concerns? And when we can't reach the reporting party, we're going out there blind. The name of the child, if you have the date of birth, approximate age, address, apartment number. Siblings. Worst thing for a worker is to get out and interview a child and they tell you about their 4 brothers that are at 4 different schools. Because our job is to go out and interview the child that we are concerned about and all the siblings. And we need to do that before we talk to the parents. So if they have siblings, if there's somebody else living in the home, Uncle so-and-so lives there, Auntie so-and-so lives there, let us know that. Names of the parents or caregivers. A lot of our kiddos are in relative care. That's just a family is raising the kids. Let us know who the primary caregiver is. Name of the school, because we're going to go there first. If they have an IEP or a diagnosis, that's helpful too, because then we can bring their IEP teacher in or their special day class teacher in when we talk to them to make them more comfortable. If there's any developmental delays or medical concerns, some of our kiddos have ongoing medical needs that may not be met, so we need to make sure we know about them. Description of the injury, where it is, what is it, how big is it, why is it a concern, the behavior they're displaying, how often does it happen, what does it look like when they behave this way, or whatever other concerns you have. The child doesn't seem to be bathing. The child seems more depressed than usual. The child is saying that somebody's hurting them. Whatever the concerns are, let us know what they are.
Clarification, agency name, that would be VAS?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no worries. Go ahead.
Do you guys interview the kids and never tell the parents would might not ever know?
No. By law, we have to tell the parents. California law allows us to go to the school and interview them there. And the reason for that is to have a clean interview, because oftentimes when we go to the home, the perpetrator's there, and they're intimidated, and they're scared, and we don't get a disclosure. With school, they are by law allowed to have somebody there with them. So we have to ask them. And it can be their teacher, it can be the school nurse, it can be the principal, it can be anybody that child feels comfortable with. That way, it's a setting where they're not in trouble, and if they want to disclose, they can. But we absolutely have to make contact, or at least attempt, that day that we see the kiddos.
So you see the kids first and then tell the parents?
Yeah. Most often, we'll go to the school, and then we'll go to the home. And if we don't reach them at the home, we'll leave a card, or I'll pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, I talked to your kiddos today. We need to meet. Some parents are willing to talk to me, some are not. Yeah, parents can get pretty upset, obviously, and understandably. A lot of our referrals, there's nothing to them. Somebody's mad at somebody, some neighbor, some relative, custody battles. We have a lot of that. But we also have a lot of kiddos that are being really, really hurt. In the last 3 years, the level of abuse has increased to fatalities. And I've never seen it before. And it's scary. It's just scary. So, you know, when we're in charge of those kiddos, we got to do what we can to help them if they need it. So it's better to over-report than under-report.
If you call and on one neglect or abuse and you go to the home and you see there's more,
Mm-hmm.
then you take care of it.
Yeah, what we do when we interview kiddos is we talk about all areas of abuse, and we don't sit down with them and say, is somebody abusing it? We'll talk to them, see how their home life is. Who do you live with? Do you have chores at home? What happens if you don't do your chores? You ever get in trouble? So we're going to talk to them about physical abuse. We're going to talk to them about sexual abuse. We're going to talk to them about neglect. We're going to talk to them about drug abuse in the home. We're going to talk to them about domestic violence. And
Does that include living in appropriate?
absolutely. And you know, what we call it is the minimum standard level of care, which may not be somewhere I want to live, but isn't necessarily dangerous to a child. We have to assess it for, is it unhealthy? Is it hazardous? I've been in some places that have been really borderline. When a child can describe to me the entire life cycle of the maggots that live in her house, I'm extremely concerned about her welfare. If there's laundry everywhere and that's just where they keep their clothes, that's not really a protective issue. Feces in the home, the kid's coming out. Whether it's going to grandma for 2 days while you clean this up, it's just not safe. We have kiddos that are in homes with no running water. Not really a protective issue. Do they bathe? Do they have access to water? So the minimum is it dangerous, basically? So, I'll go to friends' homes and they'll be like, oh God, I'm sorry, my house is a mess. And I'm like, do you remember what I do for a living? This is not a mess. So you kind of go to unhealthy, protective issue.
What if you feel like that there's like kind of that you're straddling the fence, right?
Right.
And then when you talk to the child and you touch base with them, they only have like wonderful glowing report of their parent
Mm-hmm.
and what's happening at home, even though like what you see in them or on them, around them is different.
Mm-hmm.
But in their mind, it's fine. And in their mind, they love their parent. And
Right.
it's
So then you ask yourself, how is this condition that I'm concerned about impacting this child? Is it dangerous? Is it unhealthy? Or is this child really okay, and is this a minimum standard level of care? Or is this kid just so unaware of the dangers that are going on in the home? Because our threshold to file and be able to remove a child is whatever the protective issue, how does this impact the child? And it could be, even though, the kid's glowing and happy, it could still be impacting them. Yeah, I would just, watch it and just see if there's any other outward signs, or, you can ask a couple questions like, hey, how's it going at home? Or who lives there? Or what'd you have for dinner last night? Or, whatever you're concerned about, you can ask some questions about it. Not interview them or lead them, but just ask,
okay.
especially if you're concerned. Always keep in mind, you're required to report suspicion or disclosure of abuse or neglect. So if a kiddo comes up to you and says, I got this really big bruise and my dad hit me. Is it true? Is it not? I don't know. The kid's got a bruise and says dad hit him. Probably want to report that. If this is a kid that says my dad hits me every day and he has no bruises and he's kind of wacky, then it's kind of discretionary. But if you see a marker or bruise and it's connected to a disclosure of abuse or neglect, you're going to want to report.
Clarification on that.
Sure.
What if you see a bruise and the kid says, I got hit, but does not want to say who did it?
I would be concerned about that.
That would fall within the
Yeah,
parameters of-
you see a marker or bruise, say, especially on the eye,
Right.
you're going to wonder how that happened. And he says, I got hit. You don't know who did it. Could have been a parent, could have been a sibling, but maybe that's neglect because the parent isn't supervising that kid.
So that falls within the parameters
Yeah.
of abuse.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what if you file a report
Uh-huh.
and then the kid comes in the next day
Right.
with something else, like a bruise that wasn't there before? Would you file again?
I would call back and say, I made a report yesterday. Kid just came in today with a bruise, and they'll do a follow-up report.
Okay.
That way we'll get all of the information. Really important, good question, thank you. All of our victims for child welfare are under 18. If they're over 18, it goes to Adult Protective Services. Even if it's historical or past abuse, you may get a kiddo that says, 8 years ago, somebody touched me inappropriately. That may or may not have been reported, and we're going to want to know. So please do report historical or past abuse. It may have been investigated, but it may not have, and that person may have access to this child or other children. More information you provide, the better we can assess for safety and risk, because that's what we do when we go out there. Immediate safety and risk to children. And you guys are the eyes and ears. You guys know. You guys are on the ground. So that's where our information comes from. We can't be out there. I mean, I'm out on a lot of different reservations, but I don't know the people. I don't know the community as well as everybody here. Go ahead. These are the things you're going to want to report. physical abuse, neglect, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and CSEC, commercial sexual exploitation of children. Unfortunately, this has become so explosive now. I don't know exactly what's going on, but all of our children now, when they come into care, are screened for this.
Will you explain what that is?
That is when a child is sold or used for sexual favors, sexual work. They're bought and sold. They're traded. They're traded for drugs. They're traded for money. It's horrible. And they're coming through. Some of them are starting from Mexico, crossing into the border, and coming up through the reservations up into Los Angeles. So they're not talking about it. I mean, we are, obviously, because we're aware of it, but it's not in the media as much as it should be. I mean, this is happening to our kids everywhere. And the most vulnerable populations are really being affected. So this is happening. So just be aware that it is something that's happening, and if you have a suspicion about it, please do report. Go ahead. Physical abuse is considered non-accidental injuries. Kids fall all the time. Kids get bruises all the time. I'm not real concerned with bruises knees down, little ones with them on their head when they fall over and hit the furniture. Bruising in this mid-region, I'm kind of concerned about. Bruising up here, grab marks, things like that, I'm worried about. And there's a difference. I mean, you know, if a kid says, I have this injury because I fell off my bike, could probably happen. But if it's a place on a body where that probably didn't happen, I would be suspicious about it. Kids are going to have marks and bruises. It's not always the result of child abuse. Kids get hurt during domestic violence more often than is reported. They get in the middle. They get accidentally hit with something. And the emotional abuse, I'll get into emotional abuse a little bit later, but the domestic violence causes such emotional damage to kids, and they're finding brain development is affected when kids live in households that have domestic violence. But as far as physical abuse, any unexplained injuries, unknown origin that are suspicious for abuse. Again, kids fall. You don't have to report every bruise on every kid, especially if, you know, the kid's like, hey, you know, my sister hit me with her toy and he's got like a square mark on his face where she probably hit him with the toy. It's anything you kind of think is a little suspicious. Go ahead. Physical abuse is also corporal punishment. These are some examples: choking, smothering, shaking, hitting on a vulnerable part of the body, especially the midsection. Physical activity that exceeds the child's age or development. We have parents that will exercise their children to punish them beyond what is reasonable. The other thing to know about physical abuse too, it's an intent. It's an intent to harm. It's, you know, when you pass that threshold and you're going to teach that kid a lesson and you're going to hurt them, that's no longer discipline. That's physical abuse. Sometimes it's malicious. Sometimes they plan it out. They are going to teach this child a lesson. We've had cases where there's been ritual abuse of children, where every day this child has been physically hurt. Dangerous objects, belt buckle, extension cord. The state of California says you can discipline your child, but you cannot leave marks or bruises. Implements, dangerous objects, even non-dangerous objects, spatulas, wooden spoons, still leave marks or bruises. It's unnecessary. We encourage not to use any implements if you're going to discipline. We encourage any other discipline than physical discipline. But the state of California says you can do it. But the intent to cause harm, you've crossed into physical abuse. Neglect is really open to interpretation. There's some caregivers that may not give the level of care that they should, but it may not be considered abuse. But the minimum standard level of care is going to be food, clothing, shelter, medical care, and supervision. Mental health also falls under that. If you've got a kiddo that clearly needs to be screened for a mental health issue, parents know about it, but they're not following through, it's neglect. Drug use. When you're high, you can't parent the way you should, and it can be a protective issue. Lack of supervision, that's really, we look at parents to know the maturity level of their child. I mean, you're not going to leave a 2 or 3-year-old home alone. That's not okay. Maybe you're going to leave an 11, 12-year-old home, but is that kiddo going to be safe? So these things all can be protective issues, but they're not always protective issues. Go ahead. So also, what happens often in our cases is the abuser will be one parent and not the other. The other parent doesn't physically abuse the child, doesn't expose the child to sexual abuse, doesn't do any of that, but lets this person do it. And that's failure to protect on the other parent's part. You're still required to protect your child from abuse, even if you're not the abuser. And then some of our parents will take their kiddos to the store and shoplift and use the stroller, or physically put the items on the child. That's also neglect. Go ahead. Severe neglect, we're filing more petitions now on this. There's a condition called failure to thrive. Has anybody heard of that? Are you familiar with, is everybody? Okay. Failure to thrive can be caused by a medical condition, but when it is not caused by a medical condition, it is always, always severe neglect. It's environmental. Something's going on in that kiddo's home where they're not getting what they need to live. So that's considered severe neglect. Sometimes our kiddos will get into a box with a gun in it and hurt themselves or hurt somebody else. That's severe neglect. DUI with your kiddo in the car, severe neglect. Leaving kiddos in the car during extreme temperatures too, severe neglect. This is the CSEC that we talked a little bit about. It's any form of human trafficking. Sexual abuse of a child in exchange for cash or something of value, or to threaten the child. We'll see a lot of kiddos that have a history of abuse being part of this. Runaways, homelessness, kiddos that aren't attending school may have a substance abuse problem or have been involved in a domestic violence or interpersonal violent relationship. Sometimes it's just kiddos that are out on the street and they've got nothing else. And so these people prey on them. And it's a lot like, when you have kiddos on the street and they have a pimp and they get into prostitution because they don't have anything else to do. The difference with this is the buying and selling of children. This is kiddos under the age of 18. So that's the difference. Sexual abuse includes any sexual act on a child by anyone. The most concerning thing is when a sexual abuse perpetrator lives in the home, if it's mom or it's dad or it's uncle. There's sometimes verbal disclosures, sometimes there's nonverbal disclosures. Often our sexual abuse victims will recant. They will tell somebody, we'll come out, we'll ask them about it, and they'll say, I never said that. It's not unusual, but it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Oftentimes they're exposed to sexual material. That's also sexual abuse. Anything above whatever their age is, they don't need to be involved in any of that. Anybody under the 18 really doesn't need to be. The exploitation is part of the CSEC, where you involve the child in sexual acts or engaging them in prostitution or pornography. This happens a lot with our CSEC kids. The parents let them have access to this material. They're seeing it going on in the home. And this is all for the gratification of adults. And we're talking kids under 18. No adult needs to be having any of that with anybody under 18. Go ahead. With sexual abuse, we don't even interview the child extensively. If I'm in an interview, you know, we're going to talk about who's in your house and how does everybody get along and has anybody ever touched you inappropriately? Yes. Tell me about that. Once they start to disclose, that's it. I wrap up the interview and I call law enforcement. Because what we do with those kiddos is we have a trained psychologist that then interviews them. So I'm not interviewing them, law enforcement isn't interviewing them, they only have to disclose once. And you know, sometimes you'll get into an interview and a kiddo will say, yes, somebody's touched me inappropriately. Oh, well, tell me a little about that. Oh, well, you know, this kid in my class and he did this and, you know, it's a little different. And if you're going down that line, it's like you can keep moving. But when you start getting, well, Uncle John was at the house and he came into my bedroom, I'm going to stop. I'm going to wrap this up and I'm going to let law enforcement know and have them interview. And if it's nothing, it's nothing. But if it's something, then they need to be properly interviewed. If you are that mandated reporter that spoke to that child, don't re-interview them. Don't have your boss re-interview them. Just at that point, call us or call law enforcement. We ask that you don't notify the parents or the caregiver of the disclosure because we're going to let law enforcement handle it. And really important, use the same terms that the kid used because they identify their body parts, everybody differently. So if you ask them about this part and it's not the word they use, they may deny the disclosure. So if there's a specific word they used, please include that. Go ahead. Emotional abuse is one of our toughest ones to file a petition on because it's not tangible. Parents do bizarre and cruel things to their kids that cause the kids sometimes to have anxiety or lose sleep or tend to have a little bit different behavior than what you're used to seeing. But for us to be able to say that it was the domestic violence perhaps that has caused this behavior in the child is sometimes difficult. We know what's happening, we know that there's emotional abuse in the home, but getting that petition or proving that makes it really difficult. Domestic violence is our #1 cause of emotional abuse in our kiddos, unfortunately. When I first started in this field, I had to listen to a 911 tape of a 4-year-old calling the police. And you could hear what was happening. And this kid was screaming, "Help me, he's gonna kill her." That is not a 4-year-old's responsibility. It's not okay. We can't do that to our kiddos. No, they weren't. They were in the closet crying because they were so scared. So it's happening. It's really sad and it's really scary for our kiddos. So also mental health. Just because somebody has a mental health condition doesn't mean that it's a protective issue, but if they're untreated and they're causing emotional abuse to their kids, then it can be a protective issue. Go ahead. In this field, we really need to be cognizant of cultural diversity and child abuse. Sometimes cultural practices aren't necessarily abusive, although it can appear that way. Is anybody familiar with cupping? Okay. It's a practice where they heat a cup and then they put it on the skin and it pulls out the toxins. And it leaves these really red, really scary looking. Yes. And on a kid, it looks really scary. Like, what are they doing to you? But it's a cultural practice, and the intent is not to harm. The intent is to heal the child. So just being aware that it may not be abuse necessarily. Well, and I'm not saying that they can do it, but just being aware that their intent maybe wasn't to harm.
I just had it done like 2 months ago. I was surprised how painful it is.
Yeah.
I wouldn't want any child to.
But you know, I'll talk to a kiddo and they're like, yeah, my auntie comes twice a year. She does it to me. And I'm like, does it bother you? No, not really. Does it hurt? No, not really. I want to know what the kid's telling me. And if the kid doesn't mind, you know, I'm going to talk to the parents about it. But if the kid's like, I hate it every time she comes, I hide in my room, then we're going to talk about it a little bit more. Not necessarily that it's child abuse, but this is how it's affecting your child. So just to get more clarification on it. Also, interesting enough, are people familiar with Mongolian spots? They're kind of a bluish gray, kind of a mark that some of our kiddos have, usually on their lower back, sometimes on their buttocks. It's just a coloring on their skin. Some of them have it, but it really presents as really hellacious bruising. It's not. It's a Mongolian spot. So I always ask parents, have your doctor document it. So if somebody calls in, then we know it's just a Mongolian spot. With that said, any kid over the age of 3, not going to have Mongolian spots. It's probably a bruise. Over the age of 3. 3 and under, but they usually have them. Everybody raises their kids different. Again, just because I may not want to live in that house, it may not be a protective issue for that kiddo. It may be a protective issue for that kiddo. Are there exposed wires? Are there doors? Are animals coming into the house? Does the kid have access to fresh, clean water? Is there food in the house? Those are the things you're going to want to be knowledgeable of if you're calling in a referral about a concern about a dirty home. Tell me about it. What's in there? What do you know that could be dangerous in there? They haven't had food. The circuits don't work and they're snapping and they could be exposed to electrical stuff. I mean, that's concerning. But just, you know, the law doesn't exempt cultural practices from reporting requirements if it's abusive. Again, like you said, that hurt you when you did it. So you would be concerned about a child. And just because it's a cultural practice doesn't mean that it's above the law. And just, we encourage you just to be culturally sensitive. I mean, I don't know everybody's cultural practices, but I try to be open to, well, maybe that's how that family works. A majority of the time, we try to work with the family. I give this just statistic because it's me just personally. In my experience, when I go out and investigate referrals, 60% are a custody battle, angry neighbor, angry relative. There's really nothing to it. About 20%, there's something going on with the family. They might need a little help from Tribal Family Services. They probably don't need us. So I'm at 80. So another 15%, there's a problem. But we can probably work it out on a voluntary basis. So what I'm going to do is leave that kiddo in there. I'm going to put services into the family. I'm going to do a voluntary contract with them that they're going to follow a case plan, get the help they need, and we're going to be able to work together voluntarily. About 3 to 5%, the kiddos come out of the home. We can't keep it safe. We can't put somebody in there. We can't have the perpetrator leave. It's not going to resolve the problem. So we don't like to remove children if we don't have to. But there are days where we do. So,
Foster care then?
you know what we do is we try to put them with a relative. They do go into foster care sometimes. But Rincon has a health center that we now run our kiddos through. And I think we might be able to do it at Southern in the not too distant future, because we always do a health check on our kiddos so that they go to the center like they're going to the doctor, And sometimes we're able to get a relative to come and pick them up from the doctor so they don't even come into foster care. They are in out-of-home placement. They do become dependents of our court, but we try to leave them with the family. And we try to leave them on the reservation if we can. So after you call, they determine if they're going to assign it, because like I said, some of them are evaluated out. We cross-report to law enforcement, and they cross-report to us. And at the end of the referral, feedback will be mailed to the mandated reporter. We don't tell you everything that happened. We let you know if we opened it for a case. We let you know if it was unfounded, we didn't find anything, or if the situation was stabilized, we were able to put in some services and the family's okay. But that's all you get. You don't get like, I went out to the house and I saw this. You just get something so that you know we did investigate. These are our response times. Our first is called an IRS. That's immediate response. We have from 2 to 24 hours to go out on that. And it depends on what the referral is. Generally, we'll go out within 2 hours. These are our babies, our POS-Tox babies. These are our broken babies. These are any referrals where the perpetrator may have access to the child and the child's at imminent risk. 5 days, probably the DV that I talked about, where dad was arrested, he's in jail, he's not going to be arraigned until next week. Mom got a restraining order, but we need to go out. 10 days are usually, we're concerned about the home. There's a lot of traffic. We think maybe that there might be some drug dealing there. Not sure if there's any food in the home. Those sometimes get a 10-day response, especially if the kiddos are older. 10 and older, we'll go out for a 10-day. And evaluated out is if it just doesn't meet our criteria for a protective issue. Again, oh, my neighbor, they have always got their kids and they're not watching them. And, you know, the kids are like 16 and 17 and the neighbor's mad because, you know, the kids are playing their music or whatever. So there are things that are evaluated out. But if you get more information, call back. If it was evaluated out, we could go out the next time because everything stays in the system. These are failure to report penalties. If you fail to report a suspicion of abuse or neglect, you could receive a letter. It could be considered a misdemeanor. You could be sentenced to 6 months in jail or a $1,000 fine. You may be liable for damages in a civil suit, and you could be at risk for losing your license or your credential. I've ever only seen this happen one time, and it was a therapist who didn't report abuse. They were a little enmeshed with the client, and they didn't report. I've never seen any of this happen to a mandated reporter. But just so you know, this is the law, and those could be the penalties. These are some statistics, and I really need to update them because this is 15-16. But we got 43,000 reports, which represented 80,000 children. 22,000 of those were assigned. So about half of what came in we actually assigned. Almost 2,000 we were able to work with on a voluntary basis, and about 1,200 petitions were filed. So if we investigated 44,000 children and only filed 1,200 petitions, it shows you that we don't file all that often. When kids need to come out of the home, we do have to take them out of the home, but we try voluntary. We try tribal family services, community services, so that the parents can get the help they need without the kiddos coming out of the home. There's just some other statistics about what our agency does, the age of the children, the kind of cases we have. We have this new program, well, it's not new now, but fairly recently in the last 5 years, we've started extended foster care. So kiddos that are in the system, haven't been able to reunify, can stay in the system past age 18 so that we can transition them better into adulthood, because we were finding our kiddos were either going to jail or dying, which wasn't great. So They enacted extended foster care. And I thought all my kiddos would be like, I'm out. I don't want nothing to do with you. I'm 18 years old. Every single one of mine but one stayed in and stayed until they were 21. So it's just a better way to help our kiddos that can't reunify. So does anybody have any questions about all of that information that we went over? Go ahead.
I do, I don't know if I can articulate it very well, but about the signs of kids who are abused.
Mm-hmm.
And you gave, things like more quiet or more aggressive or those things, but how do you tell the difference? Like, if a kid smells like feces every day, or, things like that, is that something to?
I would be a little concerned if they were not normally encopretic and they smell like that every day. Is that smell them? Is that smell their environment? That kind of thing. Sometimes, you just ask them a question and then they'll just tell you what's going on too. And it's not really an interview. It's just like, hey, what's going on at home? Who washes your clothes at home? Are you in charge of that? Do you know how to work the washer? And sometimes they'll get to talking to you and they'll say, I never have clean clothes. Nobody does laundry at my house. The dog poops on the laundry at home. You know what I mean? You never know for sure. It's really a suspicion within the scope of your job that you do every day. Sometimes kids don't have necessarily a behavior change. And sometimes it's just a gut and then one other thing. Like, geez, I'm worried about this kid. And then the kid comes in and says something. Or his friend says something. Or you find him hanging out with different people that maybe aren't the best influence. Or, it just may be something different. You know what I mean? We don't always know. When we go out, we don't always know. Sometimes they don't disclose. We know something's going on, but the kiddo won't tell me. He doesn't know me.
Yeah.
Most kids, though, they just start talking. Oh my gosh, yeah. You give them that one-on-one attention where they don't have to be anywhere else, and you start asking the right questions, they'll start telling you.
So it's okay to ask the question?
It's okay to ask them,
But
not lead them, and not interview them. Just, gosh, I noticed that, you've been acting a little different. Are you okay? Is everything okay? I'm just worried about you.
But how would you ask that question about that? Like, you smell, or, like, doing the laundry, they'll say, no, my mom does the laundry, and that's the end of it.
It could be. It could be. But what is your gut telling you that's going on? What's your gut saying? That there's something else is going on. So, hey, what's it like when you get home? Do you do your homework? Who's all there? What's your favorite food? Who cooks for you at home? Just some of those questions. It's not invasive. It's just kind of getting to know them, getting to know a little more about them. And then if they find you somebody they can trust, they may disclose everything. And those days you're just like, whoa, okay. Because it does happen, because kids are fiercely protective of their parents.
Yes.
But they also know at some point this isn't okay and it's not safe. So they may or may not tell. Sometimes it comes out way later. When you get the littles will just tell you, oh yeah, and then. So, but go with your gut. Ask a couple questions. What time is it? 5:20. Okay, I'll do this just real quick. See how everybody did. See if you learned something. Although this one isn't in there. Of these four, who is not a mandated reporter? Raise your hand if it's the one you pick. So not a mandated reporter. Teacher, nurse, landlord, animal control officer. Is a teacher a mandated reporter?
Yes.
Is a nurse?
Yes.
Is a landlord? No. Ah! Animal control officer is. So a landlord is not a mandated reporter. Your mandated reporters are all of those. Anybody who works with children, clergy, daycare centers, film processors. are mandated reporters. With the internet, you know, it's not so much now these days, but when we used to develop our film, they became mandated reporters.
Explain the reason why landlord would not, but yet animal control would.
Because a landlord within the scope of his profession does not oversee children.
But a landlord, especially if it's on site, can be observant of what's going on.
Absolutely, but they're not mandated to report. They do all the time,
But
yeah,
an animal control person,
is mandated, yes, because when you go out and you see an abused animal, more than likely there's abused kids in that home. And the same goes for us. When we go out and investigate children, there's gonna possibly be an animal in that yard that is also being neglected or abused. So it goes back and forth. I'm mandated to report to them and they're mandated to report to us. So reasonable suspicion. So this is really what that means, although it's just a bunch of words, but sometimes it helps. Reasonable suspicion means that it is objectively reasonable for a person to entertain a suspicion based upon facts that could cause a reasonable person in a like position, drawing upon training and experience, to suspect child abuse or neglect. So as a mandated reporter, that is what reasonable suspicion means. You don't have to have something concrete. You don't have to have paperwork. You don't have to have a mark. You don't have to have a bruise. But within the scope of your job, anybody else in that same job would probably suspect the same thing. Does that make sense? True or false? In the scope of your profession, you are mandated to report suspected child abuse only within that scope. So you're mandated to report suspected child abuse only within the scope of your profession. True or false? It's true. If you work 8 to 5, you are only a mandated reporter from 8 to 5. Should you report outside of that? Yes. It's very hard for me. My neighbors had some serious domestic violence going on, and I knew there was kiddos in the home. Did I want to call? No. Did I? Yeah. Are you required to? No. But if you are in the scope of your profession as a mandated reporter, that is the only time you're required to report. Which of the following is always considered a protective issue? Homelessness, drug abuse by parents, sexual activity between same-age minors, non-organic failure to thrive. Who says homelessness? Drug use by parents. Sexual activity between two same-age minors. Non-organic failure to thrive. Yay! Non-organic means environmental. Something's going on in that home where that kiddo is not. Well, they're not in and of themselves protective issues. Could they be? Absolutely. When your family's homeless, are the child's needs for food, shelter, clothing, and medical care being met? If they are, it's not a protective issue. But then you ask, why are you homeless? It's the drug abuse. Well, now you've got two of them that are causing an impact to the child. So again, for us, it's what's the protective issue? Does it rise to the level of intervention? And how does it impact the child? Does that make sense? Okay. Quiz is over. Does anybody have any questions that I might be able to answer? Okay. Well, that's done. I will let you go early. But if anybody has any questions, let me know. Megan has my contact information. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.